The baby's convulsions tore through the pre-dawn silence like a death scream. Ellen McCrae lurched from her thin mattress, her heart hammering as she reached for Lila, but found only twisted blankets. Another spasm racked the tiny body not on the bed, but crumpled against the far wall where fever had thrown her. No, no, no. Ellen scooped up her daughter, feeling heat radiating from the child's skin like a forge. Blood frothed at Lila's lips, and her eyes had rolled back, showing only white. The convulsions were weakening, a terrifying sign that meant the fever was winning. Ellen ran barefoot into the frozen street, her nightgown whipping around her legs. Gas lamps flickered weakly in the October darkness, casting long shadows between the ramshackle buildings of Red Oak. Behind shuttered windows, curious faces appeared, Mrs. Patterson's sharp nose pressed against glass, the banker's wife peering through lace curtains. Ellen heard whispers floating on the cold air. There she goes again. That poor child with such a mother. Shameful, really. But no doors opened. No one offered help. Ellen was invisible to their charity, visible only to their judgment. She hammered on Dr. Whitmore's door with her elbow, both arms cradling her dying daughter. Help me, please, she's dying. Light flickered behind the shutters, the scratch of boots on floorboards. Ellen could hear him moving, could feel him weighing duty against reputation through the thick oak door. Dr. Whitmore. Ellen's voice cracked with desperation. She's burning up, The door cracked open. Whitmore's gray beard appeared in the gap, his eyes taking in Ellen's wild hair, her blood-stained nightgown, the way she clutched the convulsing baby like a shield against the world's indifference. I don't treat charity cases, he said flatly. Especially not at this hour. Ellen wedged her foot in the closing door, desperation making her bold. I have gold. My husband struck it rich in the mountains. The lie came so easily now, worn smooth by 3 months of practice. Whitmore paused, greed flickering in his pale eyes. Show me. Ellen's heart plummeted. She owned exactly 3 copper pennies and a torn apron, her entire fortune. But Lila's breathing was growing shallower, each wheeze a countdown to something Ellen couldn't bear to name. She pressed her daughter into Whitmore's startled arms before he could refuse. Save her first. I'll get your money. The doctor's protests followed her as she sprinted back into the street. But Ellen was already moving, already calculating, already crossing the line that separated decent women from the other kind. The Lucky Strike Saloon never truly closed in Red Oak, a mining town that ran on whiskey and broken dreams. Even at 4 a.m, amber light spilled from its batwing doors, and the sound of drunken laughter echoed off the wooden storefronts. The smell of tobacco smoke and spilled beer hit Ellen like a physical force as she pushed inside. Conversations died. Every face turned toward her unwashed miners, professional gamblers, the kind of women who worked upstairs and didn't pretend otherwise. Ellen's nightgown drew stares that crawled over her skin like insects. Well, well. Sam Morrison, the mine foreman, looked up from his poker hand with bloodshot eyes and a predator's grin. If it ain't the virtuous widow come callin' at last. His brother snickered from across the table. Told you she'd come around eventually. They always do. Ellen forced herself to stand straight, though her legs trembled with exhaustion and shame. You said you had work for me. $1 a day. Morrison's grin widened, showing teeth stained brown with tobacco juice. Did I now? And what sort of work would that be, darling? The other men chuckled, their meaning unmistakable. Ellen felt bile rise in her throat, but Lila's image convulsing, dying, slipping away. While she hesitated gave her strength. Any kind. She whispered the words, tasting like grave dirt. Morrison stood slowly, his bulk casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the lamplight. Any kind, she says. Y'all hear that, boys? The preacher's daughter's finally ready to be practical. Ellen closed her eyes, trying to block out their laughter, trying to think of anything but what she was about to do. When she opened them, a figure had materialized in the doorway, tall and lean, with prematurely silver hair and eyes like winter storms. His hand rested casually on his gun butt, and something in his stillness made Morrison's laughter die. "Ladies with me," the stranger said quietly, but his voice carried absolute authority. There was something familiar about the way he moved, the casual competence of a man who'd lived by violence and somehow survived. Morrison's face darkened. "That's so. And who might you be, friend?" "The name's Beau Hammond." The stranger's gaze swept the room, cataloging threats with professional thoroughness. "Used to practice law before I decided some things mattered more than legal niceties." Something flickered in Morrison's eyes, recognition perhaps, or fear. "Hammond. I heard that name before. Ain't you the one who..." What Beau's voice remained conversational, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Choose your next words carefully, Morrison." Morrison's hand twitched toward his weapon, then stopped. Whatever he'd heard about Beau Hammond, it was enough to give him pause. "Seems you're interfering in private business. When I see vultures circling it, becomes my business." Beau stepped aside, gesturing for Ellen to leave. "Ma'am, you got somewhere else to be." Ellen looked between the two men, seeing her choices laid out stark and clear. Morrison's protection came with a price that would destroy her soul. This stranger offered help with no visible strings, which meant the strings were either well hidden or the help came from an unexpected source of genuine kindness. But Lila was dying, and time was bleeding away like water through a sieve. "Thank you," she whispered to Beau, and fled into the cold street. She found him a few minutes later, apparently unruffled, despite the sounds of a brief but violent confrontation that had echoed from the saloon. He pressed a leather pouch into her hands without ceremony, the weight of it substantial enough to make her gasp. $20, he said simply. "No strings, no payment expected. Just one parent helping another." Ellen stared at the money, her mind reeling. She'd been reduced to begging for scraps, and this man was offering her more money than she'd seen in months. "Why?" Beau's face was hidden in shadow, but she heard something break in his voice. "Because someone should have helped me once, and nobody did. Because some debts can only be paid forward." His words carried weight that spoke of old grief, old guilt. Ellen wanted to ask more, but Lila was dying, and questions were a luxury she couldn't afford. By the time Ellen returned to Dr. Whitmore's house, Lila's convulsions had stopped. The fever still burned, but the immediate crisis had passed. Whitmore administered laudanum with professional detachment, prescribed a bitter tonic, and accepted Ellen's payment with the air of a man conducting distasteful but necessary business. "Bring her back in 3 days," he said curtly, already dismissing them. "If she lasts that long?" Ellen carried her sleeping daughter back to their single room in Mrs. Kellerman's boarding house, passing under street lamps that cast her shadow long and thin against the wooden sidewalks. Her mind raced ahead to the consequences of what she'd done. By noon, the entire town would know she'd been in the lucky strike at dawn. By evening, they'd have invented a dozen explanations, each more damning than the last. But Lila was breathing peacefully for the first time in days, and that was worth any price. The reckoning came with the breakfast bell. Ellen had barely settled Lila back in their narrow bed when heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Mrs. Kellerman's voice, sharp with outrage, was followed by others, the refined tones of Mrs. Isabel Avery, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of Red Oak's moral standards. Seen with her own eyes bold as brass going into Morrison's place dressed like a common trollop. Ellen opened her door before they could knock, meeting their shocked stares with as much dignity as she could muster. Mrs. Kellerman stood flanked by 3 members of the Women's Committee, their faces set in identical expressions of righteous indignation. The smell of fresh bread from the kitchen below mixed with the scent of lavender water and moral superiority. "Ladies," Ellen said quietly, "how can I help you?" Mrs. Avery stepped forward, her steel-gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her skin taut. She was handsome in the way of women who'd never doubted their place in the world, with pale eyes that missed nothing and judged everything. "Miss McCrae," she said deliberately, using the unmarried title like a weapon. "We've come to discuss your activities last night." "My activities? Don't play innocent with us." Mrs. Patterson's voice was shrill with excitement. She was a thin, sharp-featured woman who collected scandal the way others collected china, hoarding each morsel to examine and share. "Half the town saw you enter in Morrison's saloon at 4 in the morning, dressed in nothing but your nightgown." Ellen felt her cheeks burn but kept her voice level. "My daughter was dying. I did what I had to do. What you had to do." Mrs. Hutchins, the minister's wife, spoke for the first time, her voice dripping with disdain. "There are Christian ways to seek help, Miss McCrae. Proper channels, decent methods." "I tried those," Ellen said simply. "They failed." Mrs. Avery moved closer, her pale eyes glittering with something that might have been satisfaction. "And so you chose to advertise yourself in the most public way possible, to confirm every suspicion, every whisper, every doubt about your character." The words hit Ellen like physical blows. These women had known her for months, had watched her struggle to maintain dignity despite impossible circumstances. But none of that mattered now. In their minds, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "What do you want?" Ellen asked quietly. Mrs. Avery's smile was cold as mountain snow. "We want what's best for everyone involved, especially for that poor child." Her gaze fell on Lila, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. "A baby deserves a proper home, with proper parents who can provide the proper care." The threat was unmistakable. Ellen's grip tightened on the door frame, every maternal instinct screaming danger. "She's my daughter. Is she?" Sheriff Morrison stepped into view from where he'd been lurking in the hallway. Sam Morrison's younger brother shared the family's predatory eyes and cruel mouth, but wore them with the authority of a badge. "Funny thing about that. I've been looking into your marriage certificate, Miss McCrae. Can't seem to find one." Ellen's blood turned to ice. "That's impossible. Henry and I were married by Pastor Williams, who died in that house fire 6 months ago along with all his records." Morrison's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Convenient, wouldn't you say? No way to verify any claims about your marital status." The world tilted around Ellen, reality shifting like sand beneath her feet. She'd been so focused on day-to-day survival that she'd never considered how her circumstances might look to hostile eyes. A woman alone with a child, no husband in sight, and no proof of marriage in a place like Red Oak that was enough to damn her completely. "The county's got facilities." Morrison continued conversationally. "Places where children can receive proper care while their mothers work out their situations. Might be the best thing for everyone involved." Ellen felt the walls closing in around her, saw her future laid out in stark detail of the workhouse, the forced labor, the slow grinding away of everything that made her who she was. And Lila growing up among strangers, learning to see her mother as the shameful woman who'd given her away. "You can't do this," she whispered. Mrs. Avery's expression softened fractionally, but her voice remained implacable. "We can, and we will. Unless, of course, you choose to leave Red Oak voluntarily. Tonight. And take your influence with you." Ellen stared at them, understanding, finally dawning. This wasn't about morality or child welfare. It was about power, about putting a desperate woman in her place before she could inspire other desperate women to similar defiance. "And if I refuse," Morrison's hand drifted toward his gun, "then we'll do our Christian duty and remove that child from an unfit environment. Tonight." The silence stretched between them, heavy with threat and implication. Ellen could hear Lila stirring in the bed behind her, could smell the lingering scent of laudanum and fever sweat. Her daughter was alive, breathing peacefully, for the first time in days. That had to count for something. But before Ellen could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. What seems to be the problem here? Beau Hammond stood at the top of the stairs, his hat in his hands, and concern written across his weathered features. But there was something else in his manner, a casual competence that made Sheriff Morrison take an involuntary step backward. Mrs. Avery recovered first, her voice taking on the tone of patient authority she used with fractious children. "Mr. Hammond, this doesn't concern you, doesn't it?" Beau moved closer, and Ellen caught a whiff of gun oil and leather. "Seems to me you're harassing a woman and her child based on nothing but gossip and spite." Morrison straightened his hand, moving toward his weapon. "Careful, stranger. You're interfering with official business." "Official business?" Beau's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "What's official about a lynch mob in petticoats?" He turned to face Morrison directly, and Ellen saw something cold and deadly flicker in his eyes. "I used to practice law, Sheriff. I know it better than you ever will. And what you're doing here ain't legal, it's just cruel." Something in Beau's voice made Morrison hesitate. There was authority there, the kind that came from experience with violence and the confidence to use it. Ellen found herself studying Beau more carefully, noting the calluses on his gun hand, the way he positioned himself to control the hallway, the professional assessment of threats and exits. "The child is at risk," Mrs. Patterson began, but Beau cut her off with a gesture. "The child is with her mother where she belongs. If you got genuine concerns about welfare, file a proper complaint with the territorial authorities. But don't stand here in the street making threats and calling it justice." Mrs. Avery seemed to sense the shifting mood. Her voice took on a note of injured innocence. "We're simply trying to protect the children of this community, Mr. Hammond. Surely even you can understand that." "What I understand," Beau said quietly, "is that you're a pack of vultures circling a woman in distress. What I understand is that you've decided to destroy someone because she don't fit your narrow definition of respectability." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What I understand is that you're no better than the road agents who rob stagecoaches. You just use shame instead of guns." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Ellen could see the impact on some faces, shame recognition, the uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something ugly masquerading as righteousness. But Mrs. Avery wasn't finished. "It's interesting that you defend her so passionately, Mr. Hammond, almost as if you have a personal interest in the outcome." The implication was clear, and Ellen felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Even Beau's defense would be twisted into evidence of her supposed immorality. "Yes," Beau said simply, and Ellen's heart sank. "I do have a personal interest." Mrs. Avery smiled triumphantly. How refreshing. Honesty at last. "My personal interest," Beau continued, his voice carrying clearly down the hallway, "is in seeing that a good woman and her child ain't destroyed by people who mistake cruelty for virtue. My personal interest is in standing up to bullies who think they can hide behind righteous words while they tear apart someone's life." Ellen felt unexpected tears sting her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of being defended, of having someone speak for her when she'd been voiceless for so long. Sheriff Morrison made one final attempt to assert authority. "That's enough. Move along, Hammond, before I decide to run you out of town." Beau turned to face him, and Ellen saw something flicker across his features, not fear, but calculation. The kind of cold assessment a predator makes before deciding whether prey is worth the effort. "On what charges, Sheriff? Speaking the truth, defending the innocent, disturbing the peace, interfering with official business. I can think of plenty of charges. Can you—" Beau's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Because I'm thinking your official business might not look too good under proper legal scrutiny." Harassing a woman without evidence, threatening to separate a mother from her child without due process. The challenge hung between them like a loaded gun. Ellen could see the decision forming in Morrison's eyes, the moment when talk would give way to action. "Beau," she said quietly, urgently, "don't." He looked back at her, and she saw the grief in his eyes again and the old pain that drove him to fight battles he couldn't win. But she also saw something else, a professional assessment of odds of angles of how fast Morrison could draw. "As someone has to," he said simply. But before Morrison could respond, before the situation could explode into violence, rapid hoofbeats echoed from the street below. A rider was approaching at full gallop, and Ellen's heart stopped as she recognized the figure. Henry McCrae sat his horse like a man possessed his clothes, travel-stained his face, gaunt with exhaustion. And something else, fear perhaps, or desperation. But it was what followed him that made Ellen's blood run cold. 3 more riders emerged from the morning haze, hard-faced men with guns prominently displayed, and the look of those who lived outside any law but their own. They fanned out behind Henry, cutting off potential escape routes with the practiced ease of experienced hunters. The lead pursuer, a thin man with dead eyes and a federal marshal's badge pinned to his vest, guided his horse closer to the boarding house. "Henry McCrae, you're under arrest for the murder of Jake Garrett and 2 of his men and the theft of their gold claims." Ellen felt the world tilt around her as the implications sank in. Henry wasn't a successful prospector, he was a fugitive, and his return had brought death to Red Oak's doorstep. "It ain't true." Henry's voice cracked with desperation. "I found them men already dead. I just took what was left behind." "Tell it to the judge," the marshal said coldly. "You've led us a merry chase, McCrae, but it ends here." But even as he spoke more, riders appeared at the far end of the street, 6 men on horseback riding hard toward the town center with weapons drawn. The Garrett gang, Ellen realized, with growing horror. They'd been hunting Henry too, and now they were all trapped in Red Oak with 2 different groups of killers converging on them. Henry looked directly at Ellen, and she saw something break in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, Ellen, I'm so damn sorry for all of it." The marshal's hand moved to his gun. "Step away from the horse, McCrae, nice and slow." But Henry wasn't looking at the marshal anymore. His gaze had shifted to Beau, and his face went white with recognition. Oh, Henry's voice was barely a whisper. "Beau Hammond." Ellen turned to look at Beau, confusion mixing with growing dread. Beau's face had gone rigid, his hand frozen halfway to his gun. "Oh, hello, Henry," Beau said quietly. "Been a long time." The marshal's eyes sharpened with interest. "You know this man, Hammond." Ellen felt pieces of a puzzle she didn't understand, clicking into place with sickening clarity. The way Beau moved his familiarity with violence, the grief he'd spoken of, all of it, took on new meaning. Henry laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitter recognition. "Know him, Ellen, meet my old partner. The man who taught me everything I know about finding gold, and taking it from people who can't fight back." The revelation hit Ellen like a physical blow. Beau, kind, gentle Beau, who'd helped her without expecting payment, was Henry's criminal partner. Everything she'd believed about him, every moment of gratitude and growing trust, had been built on lies. "That ain't how it was." Beau started, but Henry cut him off. "Ain't it Beau Hammond, the famous lawyer who decided law was less profitable than robbery? We worked together for nigh on 2 years before I got smart and went out on my own." Henry's smile was bitter as wormwood. "Though I guess I wasn't smart enough, was I, partner?" Ellen stared at Beau, seeing him as if for the first time. The careful way he carried himself, the familiarity with violence, the professional assessment of threats, all of it made terrible sense now. "You lied to me," she whispered. Beau's face was anguished. "Ellen, I can explain." Can you explain why you helped me? Was it guilt? Some kind of twisted game?" Ellen felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Was any of it real?" The marshal was watching this drama unfold with professional interest. but his attention kept shifting to the approaching riders. "Touch and reunion, but we got business to finish. Hammond, you're under arrest as well. Accessory to murder conspiracy to commit robbery. No." Ellen's voice cut through his words like a blade. "Whatever Beau did in the past, he's done nothing but help me. I won't let you take him for crimes he didn't commit." The marshal's laugh was harsh. "Lady, you don't understand what kind of men these are. I understand perfectly." Ellen stepped forward, positioning herself between Beau and the marshal. "I understand that Beau Hammond saved my daughter's life when everyone else in this town turned their backs on us. I understand that he stood up to bullies and defended the innocent. Whatever he was before, that's who he is now." Henry's face twisted with something that might have been jealousy or pain. "Ellen, you don't know what you're saying. Beau's killed more men than—" His words were cut off by the sound of gunfire from the edge of town. The Garrett gang had reached Red Oak's outskirts, and they weren't in a talking mood. The marshal cursed under his breath, his priorities rapidly shifting. "This just got a lot more complicated," he muttered, drawing his weapon. "Looks like your friends caught up McCrae." Henry's face went pale. "Those ain't my friends. Those are the men whose gold I took what's left of the Garrett gang. They've been hunting me for weeks." Ellen felt ice form in her stomach as she understood the situation. Henry hadn't just stolen from dead miners, he'd robbed a gang of very much alive and very dangerous outlaws. And now they were all trapped in Red Oak, with killers converging from multiple directions. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, mixed with whoops and gunfire. Through the boarding house windows, Ellen could see townspeople scattering for cover, could hear Sheriff Morrison shouting orders from the street below. "We need to get these people to safety," Beau said urgently, his past forgotten in the face of immediate danger. The marshal nodded grimly. "Any ideas? Because we're outnumbered and those Garrett boys don't leave witnesses." Ellen looked around at the people who'd tormented her, judged her, tried to destroy her life. Mrs. Avery pale and shaking. The women who'd whispered behind their fans, the officials who'd threatened to take her child. They were all in danger now, because of choices her husband had made. "The bank," Ellen said suddenly. "It's got a safe room, reinforced steel built to withstand dynamite. Could hold 20 people, maybe more." "That's 3 blocks, the marshal said. "We'd never make it with civilians." "Then we don't take everyone." Ellen's voice was steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "We take the children and the women who can't fight. The men hold them off long enough for the others to reach safety." Mrs. Avery stepped forward, her previous hostility forgotten in the face of mortal danger. I have the keys to the bank. My husband left them with me." Ellen looked at her former tormentor with surprise. "You'd help us after everything." Mrs. Avery's voice was barely a whisper. "I've been thinking about what you said. About Mary, about the choices I made." She straightened, some of her old authority returning. "I won't let another child die because I was too proud to act." Ellen nodded, understanding, passing between them. Whatever else divided them, they were both mothers, both women, who'd lost too much to pride and judgment. "The bank it is," Ellen said. "Beau, can you and the marshal—" "I'm going with you," Beau interrupted. "Henry can help with the defense, but you'll need protection if they break through." Henry's face twisted. "Always the hero, ain't you, partner? Always ready to save the day." "Someone has to," Beau replied quietly. "Someone has to stand between the innocent and the ones who'd hurt them." Ellen looked from one man to the other, seeing the weight of their shared history, the choices that had brought them all to this moment. Henry, her husband, the father of her child, who'd abandoned them for gold and brought death to their doorstep. Beau, the stranger, who'd shown kindness but carried violence in his past. Both flawed, both dangerous, both asking her to choose. "I ain't choosing between you," Ellen said firmly. "I'm choosing for my daughter, for these people, for what's right." The sound of gunfire was getting closer now. Through the window, Ellen could see the Garrett gang at the end of Main Street. 6 men on horseback riding hard toward the town center with rifles and revolvers blazing. "Move," the marshal shouted. "Everyone to the bank now." Chaos erupted as people scattered. Ellen found herself swept along in the rush, Lila clutched tight in her arms, Mrs. Avery's hand on her elbow, guiding her through the press of bodies. Behind them, she could hear Henry and the marshal shouting orders, trying to organize the men who'd stayed to fight. The bank was only 3 blocks away, but it felt like miles. Ellen's lungs burned as she ran down the wooden sidewalk, dodging overturned barrels and broken glass. Around her, women stumbled and fell. Children cried, men cursed, as they tried to maintain some semblance of order. A bullet splintered the wooden post beside Ellen's head, sending splinters flying. She ducked instinctively, pulling Lila closer, and kept running. Behind them, the gunfight was spreading through the town like wildfire. They reached the bank just as the first of the Garrett gang thundered into the main square. Mrs. Avery fumbled with a massive key ring, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key in the lock. "Hurry," Bo urged, positioning himself between the bank entrance and the approaching chaos. His gun was in his hand now, and Ellen could see the professional calm settling over him like a familiar coat. The door swung open, and people poured into the bank's main room. Ellen found herself pressed against the back wall with a dozen other women and twice as many children. The space was cramped, stifling, filled with the smell of fear and sweat. "There," Mrs. Avery pointed to a heavy steel door marked "Private." "The safe room. It'll hold everyone if we squeeze." Bo worked on the lock while Ellen tried to calm the crying children. Through the bank's front windows, she could see the gun battle raging in the square. Henry was crouched behind a water trough, blood on his sleeve, but still fighting. Sheriff Morrison was beside him, his young face grim with determination. The safe room door swung open, revealing a space barely large enough for its intended purpose. But it was solid steel built to withstand anything short of dynamite. And right now, it represented the only safety they had. Everyone inside. Ellen ordered taking charge when no one else seemed able to. Children first, then the bank's front window exploded inward as a stray bullet found its mark. Glass showered the main room, and several women screamed. Through the broken window, Ellen could see one of the Garrett gang dismounting, his pale eyes scanning the bank's interior with predatory interest. "Well, well," he drawled, stepping through the shattered window frame. He was a tall, thin man with the look of someone who'd lived hard and killed easy. "Looks like we found ourselves a nest of little birds." Bo stepped between the gunman and the civilians, his own weapon raised. "You want Henry McCrae? He's out in the street. These people got nothing to do with your quarrel." The gunman's smile was cold as winter. "See, that's where you're wrong, friend. Henry cost us a powerful lot of money, and money's got to come from somewhere." His gaze swept over the cowering women and children. "These nice folks look like they might have some savings tucked away." "Over my dead body," Bo said quietly. "That can be arranged." The gunman's finger tightened on his trigger, but before he could fire, Ellen stepped in front of Bo. "Wait," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "You want money? I know where it is." Both men stared at her in shock. The gunman's smile widened with interest. "Do you now? And where might that be, little lady?" Ellen's mind raced, calculating distances, angles, possibilities. She could see a heavy brass candlestick on the banker's desk, just within reach if she could get close enough. "The church collection," she said. "Sundays take plus the building fund. $500, maybe more." It was a desperate lie. The church barely collected $50 on a good Sunday, but she saw greed flicker in the gunman's eyes. "That's so, and why would you tell me that?" "Because I'd rather see the church robbed than watch you kill these children." Ellen kept her voice level, matter of fact. The money's in a strongbox behind the altar. I can show you where. The gunman considered this, his pale eyes moving from Ellen to the cowering civilians to Beau's tense form. Through the broken window, the gunfight continued, but it was moving farther away as Henry and the defenders drew the gang toward the edge of town. Interesting proposition, the gunman said finally. But I reckon I'll just take both. The church money and whatever these folks got on them. No, Ellen said firmly. One or the other. Take me to the church and I'll show you where the money is. Leave these people alone. Ellen, don't, Beau said urgently. Don't do this. It's my choice, Ellen replied, not taking her eyes off the gunman. My responsibility. The gunman laughed. Lady, you got sand, I'll give you that. But you ain't in no position to negotiate. Ain't I? Ellen shifted slightly, and the gunman tensed as he realized what she was doing. Her movement had put her directly in his line of fire to Beau. If he shot, he'd have to go through her first. You kill me, you get nothing, Ellen continued calmly. No information about the church money, no cooperation from anyone else. You'll waste time searching time you probably don't have with the marshal and his men out there. For a moment, that stretched like eternity. The three of them stood frozen, Ellen between the gunman and Beau, the children huddled behind them, the sound of gunfire echoing from the street. Then the gunman made his decision. All right, lady. You and me take a walk. But if you're lying to me... He pressed the gun barrel against Ellen's temple, the cold metal biting into her skin. I'll come back here and start with the smallest ones first. Ellen's blood turned to ice at the threat, but she forced herself to nod. I understand. She turned to Mrs. Avery, who was clutching two of the younger children. Get them in the safe room. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but the marshal. Ellen, Beau started. Do it, she said softly, looking into his eyes one last time. She could see the anguish there, the recognition that he might be watching her walk to her death. Please. Ellen kissed Lila's forehead, breathing in her daughter's scent, then handed her to Mrs. Avery. Take care of her. I will. Mrs. Avery whispered, tears streaming down her face. I promise. The gunman grabbed Ellen's arm, his grip hard enough to bruise. Move, lady, and remember, one wrong step and I'll come back for them kids. Ellen followed him out of the bank, leaving behind everything that mattered to her. The street was chaos, smoke, gunfire, shouting men. Bodies lay crumpled in the dust, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air like a shroud. They moved through the burning town, the gunman's weapon pressed against her spine, Ellen's mind cataloging every detail. The church was 2 blocks away, past the worst of the fighting. If she could get him there away from the civilians, maybe the others would have time to organize a proper defense. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to survive this and save her daughter. The church loomed ahead, its stone walls scarred by bullet holes, but still standing. Ellen felt a moment of bitter irony. She'd been driven from this place by judgment and scorn, and now she was leading danger directly to its heart. Inside, the gunman ordered, pressing the gun harder against her spine. Ellen pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping into the familiar dimness. Dust motes danced in the colored light from the stained glass windows, and the smell of old wood and forgotten prayers filled the air. But now, there was something else, the metallic tang of fear, sharp and immediate. Where's the money? The gunman demanded, his eyes scanning the empty pews. Ellen pointed toward the altar. Behind there's a hidden compartment in the floor. They moved down the center aisle, Ellen's footsteps echoing in the empty space. At the altar, she knelt and ran her hands along the wooden floor as if searching for a concealed latch. But her real target was the heavy brass candlestick that had fallen behind the altar rail. Hurry up, the gunman said, but his attention was divided, part watching, her part listening to the gunfight outside. Ellen's fingers closed around the candlestick's base. It was heavier than she'd hoped, solid brass that could crack a man's skull if swung with enough force. "Got it," she said, turning with the candlestick hidden behind her back. The gunman leaned forward eagerly, his weapon lowering slightly. "Let's see it." Ellen brought the candlestick around in a wide arc, catching him across the temple with all the desperate strength she possessed. The man dropped like a stone, his gun clattering across the floor. Ellen grabbed the weapon, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold it. She'd never fired a gun in her life, but she'd watched Henry clean his often enough to understand the basics. The weight of it was heavier than she'd expected, cold and alien in her grip. Outside, the gunfire was slowing. Either the battle was ending or the fighters were running out of ammunition. Ellen needed to get back to the bank, needed to make sure Lila was safe. She was halfway to the door when it burst open, and Henry stumbled inside. His shirt was torn, his face streaked with gunpowder and blood, but he was alive. Behind him came Beau and the marshal, both wounded, but still standing. Ellen. Henry crossed the space between them in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms. "Jesus, when I saw you leave with him, I thought you were dead for sure." "I'm all right," Ellen said, though she was shaking like a leaf in a storm. "Is it over?" "The marshal got 3 of them. I got 1, and Beau here dropped 2 more." Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. "The last one ran when he realized he was outnumbered." Ellen looked down at the unconscious gunman, then back at her husband. She could see something different in Henry's eyes, not the reckless hunger for gold that had driven him away, but genuine fear for what he might have lost. "You could have been killed," Henry continued, his voice breaking. "What were you thinking?" Ellen pulled back to look at his face, seeing the man she'd married beneath the stranger he'd become. "I was thinking about our daughter, about doing whatever it took to keep her safe." Henry's face crumpled with recognition and shame. "Like I should have done from the beginning." The marshal cleared his throat. "We need to get back to the bank. Make sure everyone's safe, then figure out what happens next." They walked back through the devastated town, stepping over broken glass and scattered debris. The bank was still standing, though its windows were shattered and bullet holes pocked its wooden facade. Ellen's heart hammered as they approached the heavy steel door of the safe room. "It's over," Beau called out. "You can come out now." The door cracked open, and Mrs. Avery's face appeared in the gap. When she saw Ellen alive and unharmed, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Thank God," she whispered, opening the door fully. Ellen rushed inside, taking Lila from Mrs. Avery's arms and holding her close. Her daughter was awake now, her fever finally broken, her eyes clear and focused. Ellen felt something inside her chest loosen for the first time in months. "Mama," Lila whispered, her tiny hand clutching at Ellen's dress. "I'm here, baby." Ellen murmured, tears streaming down her face. "Mama's here." As the other women and children emerged from the safe room, Ellen found herself face to face with Mrs. Avery. The older woman's carefully maintained composure had cracked completely, revealing something raw and human underneath. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Avery said quietly. "More than an apology. I owe you amends." Ellen studied her former tormentor's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Why, what changed?" "Watching you risk your life for people who treated you cruel. It made me remember things I'd tried to forget." Mrs. Avery's voice was barely audible. "My daughter Mary. The choices I made. The kind of woman I became." Ellen nodded slowly. "We all make choices we regret. Some of us get chances to make better ones," Mrs. Avery replied. "You gave me that chance today." Outside, the marshal was organizing the cleanup. Bodies needed to be buried, damage-assessed reports filed with the territorial authorities. But Ellen found herself drawn away from the chaos, walking toward the edge of town, where the prairie stretched endlessly westward. Henry and Beau followed her, both men silent, as they sensed the weight of decisions forming in her mind. "What happens now?" Henry asked finally, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Ellen looked down at Lila, then back at the two men who'd shaped her understanding of protection and abandonment, loyalty and betrayal. "That depends," she said carefully, "on what kind of man you choose to be from now on, Henry, and what kind of life we want to build." Henry's face was etched with pain and recognition. "I know I got no right to ask for forgiveness. What I did leaving you stealing that gold, bringing danger to Red Oak." "You're right," Ellen interrupted. "You got no right to ask, but I got a right to give it if I choose to." She paused, weighing her words carefully. "The question is whether you've learned anything from all this. Whether you understand what it means to be a husband and father, or if you're still chasing dreams that matter more than family." Henry was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Lila's peaceful face. "I understand now. I understand that I had gold in my hands and threw it away chasing fool's dreams in the mountains." He looked up at Ellen, and she saw tears glittering in his eyes. "You and Lila, you're the real treasure, the only treasure that matters. And I near lost you because I was too proud and too greedy to see it." Ellen felt something in her chest crack open, not breaking, but allowing light into spaces that had been dark for too long. "And what about him?" She looked at Beau, who'd been standing silently nearby. "What's his place in all this?" Beau stepped forward, his weathered face grave. "That's for you to decide, Ellen. I know what I did in the past. I know I got no right to ask for a place in any decent person's life. But," Ellen prompted, "but I also know that today when it mattered, I stood with you. I protected what was worth protecting. Maybe that don't make up for the past, but it's what I choose to be from now on." Ellen looked from one man to the other, seeing the weight of their shared history, their mutual guilt and desire for redemption. Two flawed men, both asking not just for forgiveness, but for the chance to be better than they'd been. "I can't stay in Red Oak," Ellen said finally. "Too much has happened here. Too much judgment, too much pain. Lila deserves to grow up somewhere she ain't carrying the weight of her parents' mistakes." Henry nodded slowly. "Where would you want to go?" "Oregon," Ellen said without hesitation. "I heard there's good farmland there, and they're not so particular about people's histories. We could build something honest and lasting." "Oregon's a long way," Beau said quietly. "Good," Ellen replied. "The farther we go from who we used to be, the better chance we got of becoming who we ought to be." She looked at both men, her decision crystallizing with each word. "I'm going to Oregon with my daughter. You can come with us if you want, both of you. But understand this, we're going to be a family, strange as that might sound. Not conventional, not respectable by most standards, but family nonetheless." Ellen's voice grew stronger, carrying the authority of someone who'd faced death and emerged unbroken. "If you can't handle that, if you can't put aside your pride and your past and work together for something bigger than yourselves, then you best say so now." Henry and Beau looked at each other across the years of shared guilt and mutual distrust. Ellen could see them weighing their options, calculating the costs of cooperation versus the price of continued conflict. "For her," Beau said finally, nodding toward Lila. "For your daughter, I can try." Henry was silent for a longer moment, his face working through emotions Ellen couldn't fully read. When he spoke, his voice was rough, with unshed tears. "I don't deserve this chance." "No." Ellen agreed without hesitation. "You don't. But Lila deserves a father, and I deserve a husband who'll stand by his family. If you can be those things, the past don't matter." Henry nodded slowly, acceptance and gratitude mingling in his expression. "I'll try. God help me. I'll try to be the man you both deserve." As the sun began to set over Red Oak, painting the sky the color of hope and redemption, Ellen felt a sense of peace settle over her for the first time in months. Tomorrow they would begin the long journey west, leaving behind everything familiar in search of something better. But tonight, She stood at the edge of the prairie with her daughter in her arms, and two imperfect men beside her, no longer the branded woman, but finally free to write her own story. The road ahead would be hard, full of challenges and uncertainties. But it was theirs to travel, and that was enough. In the distance, a meadowlark called to its mate, the sound carrying across the empty land, like a promise that somewhere, somehow, there was still room in the world for the lost to find their way home. Ellen McCrae walked toward that promise, her strange, wounded family beside her, no longer branded as fallen, but finally free to rise. The story of what came next was just beginning, written in dust and hope, and the stubborn refusal to accept that some things could never be forgiven. The wagon wheels would turn tomorrow, carrying them toward a new life built on the ashes of the old. Behind them, Red Oak would continue its daily business, forever changed by the events of this day. Some would remember the lessons learned. Others would forget by morning. But the choice would always be there, waiting to be made, one act of kindness or cruelty at a time. Ellen McCrae had made her choice. Now it was time to live with the consequences. And for the first time in months, those consequences felt like freedom.